Welcome to the Hudson Institute. I'm Bryan Clark, a senior fellow at the Institute and director of the Hudson Center for Defense Concepts and Technology. We're here today to have a conversation about future military operations and the future of warfare, specifically talking about the role of lethality and attrition in warfare. And we have a couple of guests today that I think are going to make for a very interesting conversation about these trends in warfare and some of the work that Hudson's been doing in this area. Lieutenant Colonel David Grossman is a U.S. Army Ranger, paratrooper, and former West Point psychology professor. Since he retired from the Army in 1998, he's been on the road nearly every day of the year, 300 days or more, as one of the nation's leading trainers for military, law enforcement, and mental health providers, as well as school safety organizations. He's an author that most prominently wrote On Killing, which has been a bestseller and sold more than 500,000 copies. He's testified before the U.S. Senate, U.S. Congress, and state legislatures about the use of lethality and the use of and the employment of lethal methods in both law enforcement and in warfare. And he's presented papers at multiple associations, the AMA, the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, as well as the American Academy of Pediatrics. And today he is the director of the Killology Research Group, which you can find online. Also with us today is David Roberts, who's a very accomplished technology entrepreneur and former military officer. He is the founder and CEO of Jedi Training, which is a 2-year leadership training program that's led by elite combat warriors, human performance experts, and prominent and renowned physicians and scientists. He's also the founder of Exponential Leadership, which is an organization dedicated to the transforming global leadership through courage, compassion, and integrity. He has a Harvard MBA and a degree in computer science from MIT. He started out as a military officer and is a decorated special agent with the US government. He's also led in technology some of the development of the most complex systems that were built to do surveillance, including spy satellites and the US drone program, which he was involved in. And in the civilian world, he was involved in multiple high-tech entrepreneurial ventures that gathered more than $140 million from venture firms from Kleiner Perkins to Incatel. And he was also the founder and president of FireDrop and Zaplet, which are a couple of companies that later merged to form Metric Stream. And he's now a board director on those 3 companies. And he was also an investment banker in Goldman Sachs, one of the more traditional approaches to finance. So it's great to have them both here. Their diverse experience, I think, is going to make for a very interesting conversation. So gentlemen, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Total pleasure. Thank you for having us.
My pleasure.
So the reason that we wanted to have this conversation is some of the work that Hudson's been doing over the last few years with DARPA and other parts of DoD has focused on the kind of emerging shift in warfare away from using precision strike networks and stealth technology to try to get an advantage over an opponent through attrition or lethality by just getting better at delivering weapons, penetrating enemy airspace and water space, and then being able to destroy enemy forces. And the shift we're seeing is now with the advent of artificial intelligence and with autonomous systems, we're able to start creating situations where opponents are able to, or military combatants are able to present their adversaries with a lot of dilemmas that might cut off any paths towards them achieving their objectives, and thereby reduce the need for lethality and attrition, and instead kind of force a stalemate, if you will, force situations where an opponent that's seeking to start an act of aggression, like maybe China invading Taiwan, is faced with a situation that's so complex, so changing, so adaptable, they don't see a clear path to victory on terms they would find acceptable. And so this shift in warfare away from relying on just fighting it out in attrition to instead trying to create a decision-making advantage that puts your opponents in a box or in a box canyon where they can't get out, is an emerging trend that it seems like new technologies are potentially going to enable. We can see a little bit of that today with what China and Russia are both doing in their gray zone operations, where they don't necessarily have to kill large numbers of forces to be able to achieve objectives against their neighbors, such as gaining territory, gaining influence, and being able to put their opponents in sort of a destabilized situation, like we've seen in Ukraine, like we've seen in the South China Sea. So this shift away from attrition and lethality was important, and we think that's sort of a key element of this. And I thought it'd be really interesting for us to talk about sort of how that plays out in how that's played out in both law enforcement and in military operations of late, and what are maybe some of the downsides to this idea that we might be moving towards a warfare approach that doesn't involve attrition, that we think involves less lethality? Are we fooling ourselves? And in fact, we're gonna find ourselves right back where we were, where killing people ends up being the main way that we achieve our military goals. So the U.S. is developing a new defense strategy right now. That new defense strategy is likely to look at some of these shifts. I mean, based on what we're seeing thus far, the defense strategy is going to try to move towards, more of a deterrence approach that uses the whole of government, that puts enemies into your kind of dilemmas that they can't get out of, and tries to achieve an objective without actually fighting or killing that much. Do you think that's realistic for the U.S. to think that we can get away from warfare involving killing to the degree that we've seen in the past? If it is feasible, have we seen examples of where that's worked in the past? So, Colonel Grossman, I'll start with you.
Well, Bryan, it's very, very valuable to take a look at the emerging trends. I think the first thing we need to do is look at some past trends that need to be confronted and rejected. And one of the things that I want us to look at is some of the universal dynamics that never change. So when we look at past trends, in World War I, we had vast numbers of psychiatric casualties that were driven off the battlefield. And they thought it was shell shock, what today we call TBI. We know today that it was some TBI and a lot of PTSD, or a lot of pathological interpersonal aggression dynamics. But we went into World War II with this belief that we could bomb cities and give them shell shock, and millions of gibbering lunatics would flee into the countryside. And they really believed that. We had Doha, command of the air, Italian philosopher, military leader. And so when it came time for Germany to face England, do we pay the price coming across the ocean, or do we bomb them from the air? And the Luftwaffe told Hitler, we can win this war from the air. We will simply bomb their cities. We will destroy their will. We'll create millions of psychiatric casualties that will flee into the countryside. And it is such a clean, sterile, attractive way to fight a war. But it didn't work. All it did was harden England's heart. It reinforced their will. The term I pose is distant punishment. Bombs from 20,000 feet doesn't modify people's behavior. There has to be that interpersonal human aggression. And that is really the timeless element. To say that we could transform Afghanistan with Hellfire missiles is like saying we could police New York City with Hellfire missiles. It's the interpersonal human dynamic. You mentioned my book on killing. It's one of a dozen books I have out. 500,000 copies sold in English alone, translated into 7 languages. Marine Corps commandants required reading ever since it came out. One of the things we talk about, it's Google Scholar says it's been cited over 3,000 times in scholarly works, which is really, really pretty amazing. But one of the things we need to understand is that the timeless element of warfare is interpersonal human aggression that modifies our behavior. The DSM, the Bible of psychology, says whenever the cause of your trauma is human in nature, rape, torture, the degree of trauma is usually more severe and long lasting. So a tornado hits a house, a bomb hits a house from 10,000 feet. We don't take that personally. Somebody comes into our house, it changes everything. I trained the first batch of Spec Ops headed off to Afghanistan. I've been really involved in this war from the very beginning. But simultaneously, I believe I am the only law enforcement trainer in American history to be post-certified in all 50 states. I've trained cops in all 50 states, every federal agency. And throughout the war, periodically I'd touch base with the DEA, our Drug Enforcement Administration. And they'd talk about sending DEA agents into Afghanistan, arresting them for drug charges, taking them to America. And how absolutely stunning that was, how that transformed their behavior, how that scared the hell out of them. We got to wrap our mind around the fact that bombs from 20,000 feet, Hellfire missiles, and you got to look at this hellfire missiles, the fires of hell. You get it? We make a religious statement every time we whack them. We don't even get it. They get it. So there's this enormous buildup of payback, cowardly attacks done from distance. It doesn't modify people's behavior, actually hardens their heart. So going back to our World War II example, we turned around and tried to bomb Germany into submission. And the Rand Institute study at the end of the war demonstrated that we had very, very little impact. Firebombing Dresden or Hamburg, those are ones that broke the dynamic and had enormous impact. That sent people fleeing into the countrysides. Firebombing Tokyo, over a period of 2 nights, we killed almost a 250,000 people. But it wasn't until we dropped nukes that finally they said, okay, we give. This is too much. But this idea of distant punishment, it only works when you take out whole cities. It is really not morally feasible. It's not viable. And again, you can no more manage Afghanistan from the air than we could police New York City from the air. But there's another dynamic on all this we got to think about, is this buildup of payback, this sense that we're being attacked in a cowardly way, that they don't face us one-on-one. Interpersonal human aggression is what modifies people's behavior. It is what I call the universal human phobia. If you don't have somebody on the ground, physically advancing and aggressing and taking boots on the ground to occupy a piece of terrain, all you're doing with airstrikes is hardening their will. And so it's an interesting dynamic, but I would be willing to bet you that somebody told the National Command Authority, yeah, we're going to pull out of Afghanistan, but don't worry, we'll still have our air assets. We'll still be given airstrikes. We'll still be hammering them with drone strikes. Don't worry, we'll still have a hand in there. We'll win this war from the air. And I will bet you anything you want that once again, some air power adherent says, we'll win this war from the air. And once again, they failed. How many times do we have to make the same mistake? The bombing of North Vietnam in during the Vietnam War, how many times do we keep making this mistake? But now the Marine Corps has drones. And of course, our intelligence agency has drones, and the Air Force has drones, and the Navy has drones. The only one that doesn't have drones that can kill people is the Army, and they sure want them. Everybody, no longer is it the bomber mafia, no longer is it some cabal in the Air Force. Now everybody has this tool, and they all want to use it. They all want to win wars with it. And we need to recognize 2 dynamics. Number one, a past trend that needs to be rejected, that we can win a war from the air. Distant punishment, all it does is piss people off. All it does is harden their hearts, number one. Number two, we can never lose track of the universal human dynamic, that it is interpersonal human aggression. It is ground troops reinforcing that airstrike, which is what actually makes the difference in modifying human behavior. Again, it is as absurd as thinking we could police New York City with drone strikes, when in reality we need tens of thousands of cops on the ground interacting every day to even have a prayer of policing any city anywhere in the world. So the dynamic is not so much new trends, it's this reoccurring myth that has to be confronted, number one. Number two, the universal human dynamic. As to new trends, I tell you that the DEA's ability to go in and arrest this guy and put him up to trial and keep him in Guantanamo for the rest of his life, that scares the hell out of him. That modifies behavior. And we have the technology to go in and disable them, to arrest them, and to snatch them and take them off for trial and punishment. And that modifies human behavior, and the technology that makes that possible is very powerful. Now, if we sit and say, when China comes across to Taiwan, blowing up their ships is great. Stopping them from getting a foot on the ground is great. We look foolish saying that doesn't work. But this overall dynamic of how you change the hearts and minds, it isn't until China puts somebody on the ground that things begin to change and the interpersonal human dynamics begin to have their impact. And we must never lose track of, number one, that reoccurring lie, and number two, that universal human dynamic that influences behavior. I had a paper on that was presented at a major conference in the 1990s. That I now enter for record for this to recognize the fact that we said it before and we see it again. And it's even more of a threat now because everybody has distant punishment. Everybody has a piece of that pie and they all want to use it. And it can only be used when there's somebody on the ground that can reinforce that dynamic. And its best use is in support of somebody coming and snatching them, arresting them, and taking them to trial and putting them in that cell in Guantanamo for the rest of their life. That modifies behavior far, far more.
Thanks, Dave. That makes me think, and this gets to the question I wanted to ask of David Roberts was, it seems like that what you're talking about is maybe an effort to use technology in support of this more traditional, or the approach that we know has this enduring capability or enduring value of using humans and boots on the ground. So David Roberts, you were involved in the drone program. You've been involved in intelligence work. You've been involved in technology, so you have experience in all three of those areas. Do you? So it seems like we may be using drones in in a lot of times the least valuable way possible if we're using them to launch Hellfire missiles. It seems like their higher value is going to be gaining intelligence, better understanding what your opponent's doing, and then maybe facilitating these efforts on the part of people on the ground to make things happen. What has been your experience with that, and what do you think the highest value use of these autonomous systems are that are now becoming much more proliferated around the world?
Yeah. So the funny thing, I think, having been involved in the autonomous effort for a few decades now, has been the most wars, as most any general would say, get won by logistics, not by tactics. And the truth is that the best use of autonomous aircraft would have just been cargo transport. I mean, and it would have been so simple. You just take off, fly somewhere, and land. And that actually would have been a much better use, I think. But politically, it was a very difficult thing a long time ago, because many people were opposed. It was such a estranged idea to be flying planes without people in them and without pilots. It seemed irresponsible to people. I mean, now, and so the cargo transport divisions had no interest in it. So the other place was fighter planes, and that was almost too complex an effort. And it ended up being intelligence, and intelligence is actually a very complex mission, and it was a very difficult thing to do. And so I don't think it was a strategically intelligent decision to go there first. It's just that was where it could go first. My sense is the great majority of the missions are not combat missions. I mean, they're combat in the sense that they're in a combat zone, but they're not launching missiles all the time. I mean, that's a view that maybe the public has that is not probably a very accurate view. A lot of the reasoning behind drones was a reduction of lethality. I mean, if you remember, so before drones, if there was a terrorist camp somewhere and some CIA officer maybe had discovered the camp, I mean, they would have to leave the camp, and then hours later, a cruise missile would get launched from a ship or a submarine. And I mean, who knows what was there at the time. And this was a way to gain extraordinary awareness. And it was a movement of precision, but it was also a movement towards the reduction of lethality and the reduction of mistakes. I think the comments around World War II, when we think back on that, I mean, that was not only a war of attrition, but we would just bomb everything that we could strategically. And not only was it expensive, but it obviously had horrific secondary and tertiary effects because of the targeting mechanisms. And so there was a strategic movement away from that. There was a period in Vietnam where there was a very secretive project that's not secretive anymore, and it's been declassified, where the Phoenix Project, where the idea was, well, let's just take out leadership. If you just took out sort of 12 people in Vietnam, the war would likely end, because wars are often, it's a conflict of wills, whether the choices to resolve that conflict have been so reduced that war ends up being the only choice that either civilian leadership or a military commander can see as the option. It's never the first option, it's always the last. But the Phoenix project had secondary and unexpected repercussions from it. And the idea of sort of just eliminating leadership, there's some sensitivities in that discussion, but obviously if you start to do that, then your enemy starts to do that too. And then leaders really don't like the idea of being the main target. And so war is tricky. I think, when we think about what happened with the USSR, I thought that war, which was a Cold War of outspending the USSR, was a brilliant strategy. And so we avoided a truly potentially massive war out of a very different strategy. And so the idea of coming up with different options, I'm not sure that we're good at that when it extends outside of war. In other words, the long-term effects of war are often not considered, I think, in the military commander's choices, because his area of influence is that wartime realm. And this is, I think, what we're seeing as the blowback from Vietnam, now potentially the blowback that we'll see from Afghanistan. And it's difficult. If you look, say, at nuclear energy, the true costs of nuclear energy are hidden, because out of nuclear energy comes this spent nuclear fuel, which then has to be protected for 10,000 years. And no one ever takes that cost into account. War is very, very similar. The long-term costs of it are often not calculated into the cost of the decision to have this force of wills. So can we, in the civilian world, we think of this as disruptive innovation. There's competition and then there's disruption, and they're not the same thing. Disruption replaces what was there before. It doesn't compete with it. And I think it is actually time now for command authority to start to think, how can we think of new disruptive solutions? In other words, we're quite good at innovation. Innovation is making these incremental, sustainable improvements in what we're doing. And I think that's really what you're speaking to. But I think also what you're speaking to is the idea of a disruptive change that's not incremental, that's something completely different, and it obsolesces what we did before. And my belief is that any great military commander that also is backed in the ethics of humanity will have as a priority the idea of making themselves obsolesced. How can I obsolesce the need to have a military in the first place? And my sense is that too little of the budget is focused on that. My second strong sense is that the military is probably not so good at reconstitution, rebuilding a nation after a conflict. It's not the right talent, it's not the right people, it's not the right skills. And they're compelled in a way to do it. But my sense is that it's time for a completely new agency to be created with a very significant budget that has the responsibility for reconstitution. If we had had such an agency, fully staffed with talent and fully budgeted, I think what happened in Afghanistan, in Vietnam, in many of our past conflicts, we would have had a much better, longer outcome.
That's a great point. I mean, it's a great second point too. The one thing I wanted to sort of pull the string on, and I'll bring Dave into this discussion too, is the idea of disruption and disrupting military operations so that we get to a point where they are essentially obsolete, or they are, they've now, cease to be a useful path to achieving objectives. And I think if you take what we've been doing with DARPA on decision-centric warfare to its apotheosis, it creates a situation where I'm using artificially intelligent command and control systems and autonomous systems, enabled by human commanders, to create a situation where an opponent just doesn't see a path to victory that's going to be acceptable to them. There's too much uncertainty. There's too many options are available to your opponent, so it's unclear for you, exactly what's my theory of victory, in this conflict, because it's not going to be a straight ahead invasion that'll be successful. The time periods over which it'll happen are going to be too long. The cost that I'm going to incur might be too high. The reputational risk of not going well, is going to be too high to really consider. So you're essentially deterring just by virtue of the fact that it's too complex a situation to navigate on terms that you're willing to undertake as a leader. So to your point, when you're looking at your options, war becomes an even less attractive option, and you have to turn back to, well, okay, let's go back to what were the other things we left on the table: diplomacy, or economic tools, or negotiation. What are the other tools on the table? And I think one challenge we run into, or one thing we've run into in the past, is war becomes too attractive an option. Because it is, if there's a clear path to victory that an aggressor can see, then they may want to pursue that. So the idea with this approach of decision-centric warfare is, how do we close off their decision space such that war really isn't a very effective path, and that these other paths are more likely to be pursued. So Dave, one question that that comes up is, do we think that we could have a theory of victory, or a theory of deterrence, I guess if I were to say it, that doesn't involve threatening to kill the opponent, that relies mostly on making the opponent more uncertain as to their chance of success, and thereby forces them to think about other ways to achieve what they want to get? Do you think that's a viable approach?
Yeah,
I do. Dave, sorry. Two Daves.
So Dave Grossman first, and then
and I think when we talk about disruption, something that came out of 20 years of war in Iraq is worthy of mention here. In 1993, I was a young Army major in the British Staff College. Now, the U.S. Army Staff College is in Leavenworth, which is best known for its prison. Instead of spending a year in Leavenworth, I got to spend a year in England. That was a good deal. And we had the representatives of 52 foreign nations, or a whole deck of cards, 52. And anybody that had ever been part of the British Commonwealth, or a British colony, pretty much had their people there. And that included Egypt and Jordan and quite a few from various Arab nations. And we were sitting down one night and one of the big things we're constantly pushed is respect each other's culture. We all have a different culture. We respect the culture. So we were sitting down one night, and we had an awful lot of these Arab officers from across the Arab world. And we said, well, why has there never been an Arab democracy? Or why is it the one part of the world that's never had a democracy? And they all had the same answer: Arabs won't vote. There will never be an Arab democracy. You've got to respect our culture. It's just not part of our culture. There's never been an Arab democracy. There will never be an Arab democracy. How do you fight that? How do you confront that? I mean, we had to accept it. Oh, okay. And then in Iraq, all those purple fingers. And you talk about disruption. Well, all those purple fingers and all those Iraqis who risked their lives to vote, and the vast majority of which were Arabs. Then we have what we call the Arab Spring, which, democracy is going to flourish across. And of course, it wasn't quite as simple as it looked like it was going to be. But when we talk about disruption, to have actually created an Arab democracy, we really don't even begin to understand what an achievement that was, and what a transformational dynamic that was. Will the seeds take fruit? How long will it take? That's a different question. But I love what Dave was saying about this whole business of nation building, a Marshall Plan type dynamic, and the value that lies in such a dynamic, and the application of resources in that direction. And it comes back to the greatest achievement that's come out of this war, as far as I'm concerned, for all those purple fingers, and the greatest disruption in that part of the world is people saying Arabs will vote, Arabs can vote, I want some of that. And the long-term payoff on that is questionable. You know, we come back to Afghanistan. In the 1960s, we had been in Europe for 20 years. If we had abandoned them, the Russians would have owned Europe in a month. In the 1970s, we had been in South Korea for 20 years. If we had abandoned them again, the North Koreans would have owned them. And Jimmy Carter was president, and during his tenure, the communists took Nicaragua, Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia. We threw the Shah of Iran under the bus. We gave away the Panama Canal. How could one person have done so much harm in 4 years? But we also had this dynamic where Jimmy Carter says, I'm pulling our troops out of Korea. And General Singlaub, the last American general to ever resign in protest, the one right everybody has, says, no, I'm not going to do that. I resign. The last American general to resign in protest was General Singlaub. Said, no, if we do that, the North Koreans will own them in a couple of months, and all the blood and all the sacrifice that we've invested will be lost. Well, obviously, 20 years later, the Soviet Union finally collapsed. 20 years later, South Korea is a thriving organization, although could they still exist without American troops? That's a hard one. But the dynamic that we can make a change in a few decades, the model tells us that it's going to take at least 40 years, a couple of generations to get any kind of transformational change. And if we get on board, we need to plan for that long haul. So yes, there's great value in going in and establishing democracies. There's great value in going in and arresting people for war crimes and putting them in prison for the rest of their lives. There is this dynamic across that part of the world where if you kill one of our people, we are morally bound, almost religiously bound, to kill one of your people. And in their book, every time we whack somebody with a hellfire, they owe us one. And the disproportionality of the balance in their mind is significant. But when we use this technology to go in someplace to arrest them, to take them for trial and put them in prison for the rest of their life, number one, you no longer run into that cultural dynamic of you've killed somebody. Now we have to kill one of yours. And number two, we've created this transformational dynamic in which they actually are held accountable, and we use the democratic process, not execution from on far, but public trial and imprisonment as an alternative. And I submit to you that is vastly more effective at transforming human behavior.
Yeah. So, and that there's certainly a lot to be said for that. That could be an element too of deterrence. You know, so if we can show the ability to, build nations in the aftermath of a conflict, or to support nations that are pursuing more peaceful objectives, that can be an element of a set of tools for deterrence. So, David Roberts, do you see? Is there a way to deter without necessarily this threat of violence being so prominent in the tool set that we would use?
So, I do think that commanders take into as many options as they can. I'm not completely convinced yet that the technology there that we have today, at least, gives them a really great option. So, if you're a police officer and there's somebody with a knife coming at you, before there were tasers, you just had your gun, and you just had the choice of lethality. And it wasn't, you wouldn't shoot to kill, you just shoot at center of mass, which just happens, unfortunately, to also be the most lethal spot to hit. But you're shooting at center of mass, and you don't have this other option. And I'll applaud Rick Smith and his development of the taser and how much that has changed the option choice. But it was a level of sophistication in that technology that allowed that to be a new option. Because if you remember, before it, the option was the gun or the baton. Why didn't police come up with that idea? Well, the challenge, I think, comes into the nature of self-disruption, which is if you have something that is going to disrupt the very thing that you're doing, there's a counterproductive force that happens there. And so asking the military to come up with non-lethal options sounds like a great idea, but my guess is that it might be better to have that idea explored with a more separated organization. I give you an example in the commercial world. So in the commercial world, really big companies are great at innovation because it's these incremental sustainable things. If they're not good at it, they don't compete and they don't stick around. But they're terrible at self-disruption. In fact, very few companies are able to disrupt themselves. But those that are good at it, Apple Computer as an example, where they have a computer with a keyboard and then they develop the mouse, knowing that that's going to disrupt their computers with the keyboard. Or then they develop the iPad knowing it's going to disrupt the mouse. Or they have an iPod and they develop the iPhone knowing it's going to disrupt the iPod, their single best product. The cannibalization of that seems like a terrible idea, but that is actually what has led to Apple being the most valuable company in the world. This process of self-disruption. They've self-disrupted themselves 4 to 6 times. I'm not convinced that our military has disrupted itself even once yet. And in the commercial world, if you have a disruptive idea that could disrupt the company, then the company has a reaction to that the same way that your antibodies react to a cancer in yourself. I mean, it's something that could destroy people's careers, their expertise. And so the organization reacts to that in the same way that they would react to a competitor, but even worse, even in a more aggressive manner, in the same way that the US lost more people in its civil war than all of its other wars combined. And so this is, I think, the challenge is how does our civilian leadership find a path towards thinking about how we can disrupt the need to have the military that we currently have? I mean, I think I'm not positive on the numbers. I think we spend as much as the next 10 countries combined. And so how many parts of our government are thinking about how not to do that? So that, I think, is the process, at least, to get to the solution that you're speaking of, which is to think about what organizations and processes do we need to come up with these much better alternatives, and who are the right people to lead that ideation. And that, I think, will lead us to a path that is much closer towards self-disrupting our need to have as our primary option a lethal military response. And I think it's very similar to the way that, the taser technology has saved so many innocent lives because police, I don't think police, they don't want to kill the person. They just want to stop what's happening. And I don't believe the military wants to kill people. It's just, this is the only option that we think we have in order to stop or in order to compel the will of some, commander's intent or civilian intent that has been passed to the commander.
Those are great points. It relates a lot to the work we've been doing. So the idea of giving commanders more options, or leaders more options to be able to counter an opponent. And a lot of those options, could be non-lethal. I think when you say today to a military commander, I need to give you more options, they're thinking more kill chains that I can execute to be able to blow some stuff up or to kill some people. But if you talk about opening that option space to actually talk about a lot of options that don't involve killing, that involve, not just, non-lethal techniques like the taser, but also electromagnetic warfare. I can use high power microwave to disable engines or to turn off electronics. I can, just put stuff in your way that prevents you from being able to move in a particular direction. I mean, these are some techniques that actually the Russians have been using pretty effectively in Ukraine. But they give their leaders more options. And if you're the opposing side, it makes it a lot harder to kind of chart a path to victory if you're not quite sure what your adversary is likely to do. Have you found I mean, this has a lot of correlation with the technology world. Have you found that this like optionality strategy is something that, it gets pursued, more often in business or in commercial world than we see in the military? It's not something we see in the military a lot.
Yes, and it's for, I think, a very strange reason. And it goes to, there's a great Navy SEAL commander out of SEAL Team 6 who recently wrote a book. His name is Rich Divini, and he wrote a book called The Attributes. And the essence of that book says that skills are useful in known environments. In other words, if you train soldiers to shoot guns, well, then that works well in known environments, but then the minute those soldiers are underwater, well, guns don't work underwater, and so skills don't apply. But attributes, which are more sort of these characteristics like creativity or perseverance or persistence or courage or resilience, those do apply in unknown environments. My sense is that the very thing that makes our military strong, which is the degree that we train commanders. I mean, the military, I think, has a fantastic training program, and even for leaders or managers, I'll say. But I think now the ideas of leadership where disruption has become the norm, we need to train our military commanders the ideas of disruption, not innovation. Two different things. Innovation, making things better. Disruption, making things that we do obsolete. I think we need to develop a new set of commanders that think truly outside of that box. How can I achieve this objective in a way that is not the traditional thinking and not the traditional training? Because we lean towards that because we know it works and we're good at it. And often a new thing is not, there's more uncertainty around it, and there's a cost to trying new things and failing. I'm not convinced, especially when it comes to lethal matters, that we have an environment that allows for experimentation and failure without severe consequences that are quite negative. And so in the civilian sector, for organizations that have become quite good at innovation, you'll find they have very safe environments to experiment. So in a typical company, if somebody does something, if a leader, a middle manager tries something new, and you put them on a new project and it fails miserably, usually not good things happen to that manager. They get put off into other projects, they get fired. But for companies that have and understand this process of innovation, that failure is not seen in the same way as a failure. It's seen as, oh, that experiment didn't work. So now let's take that leader and put them on the next coolest hard project to see how they do, because they've gained a little experience. Sort of like in Silicon Valley, if you've worked in failed companies, that's actually seen as a benefit because you've learned, one more way that something doesn't work, which is now an advantage. So two things change. And my belief is now that all problems, and one of the things, I'll detour and it's worth spending a minute to explain this. One of the things that I'm asked to do sometimes in a company is to solve the major problems in a company. And we'll go in and say, well, let's find all the problems in the company. And we'll take the white space and we'll write all this out. And it always fills up exactly the amount of white space in the room. And then we'll say, okay, for this problem, what causes this problem? What really is the cause? And we'll find that, and they say, well, what's the cause of that? And we zero it down. And what I've learned in doing this many times now is that it typically has 5 or 7 root causes that cause each of the problems that a company experiences. And this is no different, I guarantee it, for the military. But here is the oddest thing of all that I've learned. the root cause of all the problems, there's only two real causes that fundamentally spring out all of the other problems. One is that we don't have the right talent. And the other is that we don't have the right culture. We don't have an innovative culture that can solve that problem, or we don't have really the kinds of people that can think outside of the box, or can think at a level that is higher than the level that caused that problem in the first place. My sense, and really the answer to your question would be, we need to start to think about how to have a different kind of talent that don't think in these traditional ways, that aren't trained so well. As you train better, you've developed a skill, and you actually are less able now to think differently. And can we create a culture of risk-taking and innovation where the solution isn't always a military one? Can we get good at that process so that we don't need to have wars, and we have disrupted ourselves and made war itself obsolete? I think that is a win for everyone, even the military, though they might not think of it at the time. But even the military has an extreme advantage if we don't need them anymore.
Right.
And as a nation, as a planet, we need to get there, because that is a far more ethical world.
Right. So it's a great stepping off point to ask Dave Grossman. You do a lot of training with military law enforcement. This issue that Dave brought up about we need to get the right sort of attributes in our operators, and the right culture, that has them thinking of options that are not the first most lethal thing that's available to them. How do you train that into, or how do you build that into an organization like the U.S. military, where, kind of the things that you grow up learning about are the traditional tools of the trade? So I'm a submariner. You learn about how to launch missiles and shoot torpedoes and blow up other submarines. You don't learn other ways to try to accomplish objectives. How do you start to train that into an organization like the U.S. military?
It's funny. I was just thinking along those lines. Sun Tzu. To study the Bible, if you don't learn the original Hebrew, you've got to look at multiple translations. And Sun Tzu's the same way. But my favorite translation, 2,500 years ago, you got somebody saying the greatest achievement is the battle you didn't have to fight, the war you won without fighting. And one of the commentators on this, about 500 years later, and named Sumu, he said, and I think it was sincere, he said, then who will declare you valorous? Who will give you glory? Who will give you honor if you win the war without a battle? If you win the war without fighting? And I think the answer's got to be we do. I do. I've used that line a lot. But the reward schedule, we've got to look at the reward schedule. What is the behavior that we reward? How do we take these innovative people and reward that? It's got to be built into our culture from the ground up. The tone and the culture and the reward schedule that comes into it. And I see the law enforcement community faced with the pressures they're under now. Everything everybody does is caught on camera, and them trying to transform their culture. They've always had a very good culture, and they're on their own. They're making enormous changes, but this dynamic of holding out those good videos and saying, that's who we want you to be. That's who I want to be. I don't want to be the one that got fired and sued. I want to be the one that every cop says, I want to buy that guy a beer. Yeah, and it comes back to the reward schedule. And we're seeing that in the law enforcement community, the training community right now. And it's a worthy exemplar. Then we come back to the tasers and having a greater array of options. And again, in the law enforcement community, we're using deadly force because we sincerely believe it is the only option left in the face of immediate threat of life, limb, or grievous bodily harm or self or others. And the moment that person is no longer a threat, We slap on a tourniquet, we apply CPR, we try to save that life. So, our goal in law enforcement is never to kill. And I would have told you in war, it's very similar. The moment somebody surrenders, then we take them prisoner. We don't execute them. When somebody's wounded, we don't execute them, we treat them. We got this model of MASH in our head where we treat enemy prisoners the same as we treat our own with medical treatment. And I tell people in the law enforcement community, our objective is never to kill. We're always trying to save lives. But on the other end of that spectrum, irrefutably, is that predator operator who's been ordered to kill that terrorist. And if he does not execute that terrorist, he has failed in his mission. So we've really transformed into something where we take enemy prisoners, where we treat the enemy wounded, this Korean War model in which we create this bastion of democracy. We've transformed it into where we're just going to sit back and whack people. And it's the best tool, the shiniest, best, newest tool in the toolbox. But what about the one that was won without whacking anybody? Who will declare them valorous? We do. And we got to create that reward schedule that makes that possible. We've got to hold up those examples, like the cops I was telling you about.
That's a terrific point. And so, David, you work with a lot of you do a lot of training. So, David Roberts, you do a lot of training with leaders. You have a team of people that do training that are drawn from both law enforcement and from the military. How do you begin to create this reward system, that Dave Grossman's talking about, where we can commend commanders for achieving an objective, even if it's by, just preventing the enemy from pursuing his own objective, or by, without ever having to actually fire a shot, or by just simply denying your opponent some ability to, achieve a goal. It seems like, you get rewards by, getting kill markings on the side of your airplane, or by, sinking an enemy ship. Obviously we don't do a lot of that right now, but those are the traditional measures, that we use to grade operators on. When you're training these teams, I assume, you want to train leaders that are to recognize kind of what the objectives are. Pursuit of those objectives is really what we're all about. And the path to get there may not be what the path is that we used in the past.
So I think really what you're asking is, how do disruptive new ideas survive and grow and be adopted? What I've learned in the commercial world is that in companies, at least commercial companies, most of the disruptive ideas that arrive in the companies get destroyed. And they get destroyed not for one reason, they get destroyed for 100 different reasons. But people in the organization realize, gee, if that thing is successful, then somebody's going to come and take budget from me, and it's going to go to that, because most of the budgets in our organizations they're fixed at the top. And so if you have a new program, well, the money has to come out of other people's budgets. And so many of our leaders don't actually want these other things to succeed, because we don't have the right incentives in place to be able to make that happen. And I've witnessed this, by the way, especially even at the very high program level, how difficult it is for a new program to survive, because the existing directorate managers know that if it succeeds, they're going to have to give up their best people, they're going to have to give up their budgets, the focus is going to move off of them. They have made their entire careers off of this thing, and then this other new thing is going to make everything they've done the last 10, 20, 30 years obsolete. And so it's extremely difficult. What I've seen successfully done, and I've seen it happen in two ways. There's sort of the Google way, where one, they don't actually typically try to disrupt themselves. They try to disrupt other things. They don't try and disrupt search. They try to find other things to disrupt, and they do it very open and publicly, and they believe that then attracts the best talent. So everyone knows that they're working on, say, Project Titan on Loon. They have a whole variety of projects. They make that public announcement because they believe that attracting the best talent to it is the best chances of success. There's the Apple way, which is very different, which is done in secrecy. And I think this actually has proven to work out quite well, where if you have a new idea, and I've even seen this happen in the government, if you have a new idea, you keep it quite secretive, knowing that it's fragile and that the organization wants to destroy it. And then you move it as far as possible from your existing organization. You keep it quiet, it's off the charts. People don't even know physically where they're located. And so it makes it difficult for them to mess with it. And you have to have these new disruptive ideas answered directly to the highest person in the organization. If you don't do that, people will mess with it because they can. If it answers directly to the CEO or directly to the commander, well, messing with the CEO's pet project is usually not career enhancing. And so it has a much greater chance, at least, I think, of survival. The third thing I think that has to happen is there has to be an education throughout the organization that disruption is how the organization succeeds, that without it, we're stuck in innovation, we're stuck in just sustainable incremental improvements. And it's not the future, it's not what we are. And when we make this transition, when Apple makes the transition, when they take an iPhone and they realize that it's going to disrupt their number one product, the iPod, the company, the people in the company have a feeling of security, knowing that they will be transitioned into the new thing. And that just because the thing that they were working on is no longer the high, in fact, it's going to be obsolesced and failed, that the new thing is their new excitement and adventure and opportunity. And we have to do that institutionally. And this is why I was saying, it's not just about talent, it's actually about culture. And when I speak about culture, this is culture. I'm not at all convinced that we have that culture yet in the military. If you say to the Navy SEALs, well, we have a hostage situation, or we need you to take this guy, they're going to do what they know how to do well already. And the idea of, say, using gas and just gassing everyone and never firing a shot is not going to be their first option. I've seen it work sometimes. And if I can tell this awesome story, several years ago, we had 3 contractors taken hostage by the FARC in Colombia. And normally, to recover those would be a military operation, and you'd be shooting and killing. And I won't get in all the details of it, but it was a very creative process where they had tricked the commanders of the camps to believe that these helicopters that were coming in were going to move the prisoners somewhere else. And so those commanders of these camps actually loaded those prisoners up onto the helicopters, and then we flew away. And there wasn't a single shot fired, and there wasn't one person killed. I think that level of creativity has to be reinstilled in our military leaders. How can we achieve these objectives without lethal force? Because the long-term outcome of those are so much better for the nation and even for military lives.
That's an outstanding point, Dave. And it makes me think that, inside the military, a lot of our most classified secret programs are not these new approaches that are very disruptive to the existing military model. They're usually an evolutionary innovation on the same old model, which is just some new way to destroy something or kill people. But if we instead started thinking of our special access programs as, we need to put some of these special access programs aside that are focused on an entirely different model for how you achieve military or national security objectives, would be more like how the Apple approach might work if you were applying it to the military. But that's
if I may, if we asked our military, how many teams do you have and how much of your budget is allocated to figuring out how to make yourself obsolescent?
Mm-hmm.
My guess is that number is very, very small. And here's what's fascinating. If you went to Apple Computer and I don't know the actual number, but there are so many teams chartered with figuring out how to disrupt the entire company,
right?
How to make the company's number one product completely irrelevant in the future. There are all sets of teams of varying sizes working on that problem. And we absolutely need to do the same, not because it saves American lives, not because it's cost effective, but because that is the arc towards real justice and humanity.
Right. Absolutely.
There's another angle on that, though.
Go ahead, Dave.
In that there has been this desire to make ground troops obsolescent. And there really is an entire body whose goal is to make it such that we don't have to put people on the ground. And there is this we talk about bayoneting, that in Waterloo, actual puncture wounds were a tiny fraction of what was inflicted. We think of bayonet charges, we think of sabers hacking people, and when the sabers do hack people, it's from behind. When they're running away, that's when most of the killing happens. So the only thing greater than the resistance to bayoneting somebody is the resistance to being bayoneted. And almost always one side or the other turns around and runs rather than actually go head to head and bayoneting each other. The point is that there is a resistance to being killed and a resistance to doing the killing. And there is this persistent trend throughout history to say we're going to replace the infantry, we're going to replace the guy on the ground. And then we see it with law enforcement. We'll send in social workers, we'll have cameras everywhere, we'll have shot receptors. At the same time, there is this dynamic of trying to reinforce those disruptive dynamics, but recognize that there is a disruptive dynamic that has been in play from the very beginning. That not wanting to have to send people to die, not wanting to have body bags come home, not wanting to have all these dead people on CNN that we've killed, not wanting. So just recognize that there is a persistent disruptive force. At one time we call it the bomber mafia. We're going to win the war by bombing them from 20,000 feet, and so there is a persistent human dynamic that says we don't want to send people to kill at close range. We don't want to have our people die at close range. And we're trying to find ways to avoid that. And the person who can do that is going to be embraced to a large degree. We've gone very far in doing that in this war. I've got a son with 9 combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. In World War I, it was a bad day when you lost a corps. World War II, it was a bad day when you lost a division, Normandy Beach. And in the Korean War, it's a bad day when we lost a brigade. And Vietnam, it was a bad day we lost a battalion. Dak To or Hamburger Hill. Today, it's a bad day when you lose a squad. The greatest loss of life on the ground, and we've had helicopters go down, but the actual loss of life on the ground was one odd when an infantry platoon was overrun and lost about a squad's worth of soldiers. And we've achieved that dynamic in which we bring the number of our dead troops way down, which makes it possible to sustain a war for 20 years without a draft. And we just got to recognize that at the same time, and we say we want to reward people who will make the infantry obsolete. Recognize that there has been this universal human trend from the beginning to want to do that. And archers, standoff weapons, rifles, cannons. There is this innate, again, my book on killing, as we get closer and closer, the resistance and the revulsion becomes greater and greater. And just recognize this persistent false trend. That we're going to replace the guy on the ground. We don't have to have a cop go, we'll send a social worker. We don't have to have cops everywhere, we'll put cameras on every corner. This dynamic of trying to find an alternative can also be dangerous because it is not rooted in reality of the human dynamic, that what transforms human behavior is that human being is going to land, arrest you, and take you to trial and put you in a cell to rot for the rest of your life. They don't have to avenge you when you're sitting in a cell. They avenge you when you've been killed. But it's not summary execution. It's democracy at work with a legitimate trial and then putting them in prison. So just recognize that this disruptive dynamic has been in play all along, and over again, it has been a failure. And so we've got to be careful about that. There is a force of absolutely intent on disrupting warfare. You know, again, one time we'd call it the bomber mafia, and that universal human revulsion against close combat, the universal human desire to not engage in close combat, is constantly in play and represents something that has to be dealt with very carefully.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and you know, and to wrap it up here, the most disruptive, you know, way, and just like David has talked about, you know, potentially the most disruptive capability we have is the individual, you know, operator, law enforcement person, soldier, commander, who's able to be creative and come up with alternatives if they've been properly trained and enculturated and incentivized to pursue those alternatives that are not the one that you would, you know, normally turn to today. So that, you know, humans are kind of the heart of that disruptive energy. So I'd like to thank our guests today. This is a fantastic conversation. David Roberts of the Jedi Training Institute, and also innovation leader and trainer. Also Dave Grossman, author of On Killing and law enforcement trainer and expert on lethality himself. Thank you both for being here today. We really appreciate your time, especially, you know, calling in from about, you know, 10 time zones difference. And thank you all for being here. And until next time, thank you from the Hudson Institute.
Thank you so much, Bryan.